Okay, so we live in a world shaped by technology. And I've been fortunate enough to work on, I think, 3 of the most sort of technologically advanced buildings. I think if there's one thing that we do here at the council is that the buildings that we do, these tall buildings, are a huge investment of the latest technologies. Yet I think the technologies that we've been using in these buildings they're more to kind of scale up what we've already been doing. It's sort of stretching it to greater height, yet fundamentally doesn't seem that different. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because I think the world is changing. I think it's the younger generation, the millennials, they somehow have a kind of a bit of irreverence for the monuments that we put up. I think they see the world as theirs. It's one of shared ownership and shared experiences. So these 2 gentlemen, I don't know if any of you went to the Ping An Tower yesterday, but they beat us to the top of the Ping An Tower. Actually, they scaled the construction crane and took what's been dubbed the world's most dangerous selfie. And not to be outdone by the Russian girl or Hong Kong boy, right? And I've never actually done this, but I bought myself a selfie stick. Actually, my colleague Florence did it, and I've always wanted to do it, and now that I'm chairman, I'm going to do it. Get out of the light. All right. There we go. Okay, so just to sort of get into the futures thing, if we take a look back, and we see Voyager 1, and Voyager 1, of course, was the spaceship that NASA sent out, and it's still traveling. So it's been 40 years. Right? And Voyager actually went out, and it went out to the edge of the solar system, and it turned around, and it took a selfie. Right? And this selfie has a name. It's called the pale blue dot. That little dot, you can see to the right of the text, that's the planet Earth. So that's the longest distance selfie, right, in the history of humanity. Voyager carried with it a record of what civilization was like at that point in time. It's a golden record for anyone who might discover this spacecraft in a distant galaxy. That was 1977. In 1977, the Citicorp Tower was completed. Right? Now, the Citicorp Tower, it has double-deck elevators. It has perimeter-braced frame. It has a tuned mass damper, right? These are all the things that we talk about, probably at the conference today, and as if they are like truly great innovations, but they've been around for 40 years, 40 years. In contrast, the state of the computer in 1977, right? The Apple II, and I was looking into this, and the Apple II, it had a total of 4 kilobytes of RAM, of memory, right? This has 2 gigabytes, right? So this is 500,000 times more computing power than the Apple II, which means in a handful of these, there's more computing power than in all the Apple IIs ever sold, right? So in the state of buildings in 40 years, obviously computer and technology have advanced just monumentally, and actually, the computing power of this is much greater than the computer that took us to the moon. Right? And so that's how far computers have come. But there's one thing I do want to sort of backtrack about, because it's not just about the technology, it is about the vertical futures. And so you've heard a number of us talk this morning about sustainable vertical urbanism, which might take many forms. When I became chairman of the council, I sort of threw down the gauntlet to our membership, and I said, if we don't do something about the way that we're practicing and the way that we're building our buildings, we're going to face some pretty dire consequences. And how sad would it be if we were to go, back to the moon again, take a selfie, and see something like this, right? A dying planet. And so that's what I mean by a vertical future, because it could be a positive one or it could be a catastrophic one, but it's really up to us. Because we are an urban planet, but we're not necessarily doing everything responsibly. The vertical future is a belief that height can enable a sustainable vertical habitat, that somehow, if we can build compactly and efficiently and in synergy with nature, that this is our most sustainable way to preserve our planet while still allowing for the advancement of our civilization. But there's one trick with all this density. It turns out that we are not just an urban planet, we're a coastal planet, which means somewhere from 50 to 60% of us live within 150 kilometers of a coast. So we're actually building our largest cities in the most dangerous areas of the world. Shenzhen, Hong Kong being prime examples of places which have typhoons and earthquakes. And if anything, the climate change scenario is making this all the worse. And we've seen it in New Orleans, we've seen it in New York with Hurricane Sandy. Like, major metropolises get really messed up because of climate change. I think we saw it with devastating consequences in Japan about 5 years ago. So because of that incident in Japan, I was approached by NHK, which is the Japanese television broadcasting company, and they asked me, can you design a really, really tall tower? Okay, they kind of inferred that they wanted me to propose a mile high. So what you're looking at is a mile-high tower, 1.6 kilometers tall. I said, well, if we do this tower, we need to give it a story. It needs to exist for a reason. And so I sited it in Tokyo Bay. Now, the whole premise of this is that it's not just one solitary tower, but it is this sort of urban ecosystem. What you see as these hexagons are actually buildings that are built out onto the bay that support housing. The whole city is built over a subterranean highway that exists called the Aqua Line. So it's not just about tall, but it's about habitat and infrastructure. Okay, so some of the themes of this conference. Okay, and so it addressed issues that face us today. You know, how do we provide enough food for our population? How do we provide enough clean water for our urban centers? How do we deal with aging populations, right? So these are questions that cause a great deal of anxiety. The whole purpose of this city is actually a coastal resilience barrier, right, to protect Tokyo from a future tsunami or climate change. So it's the idea about, you know, once upon a time, architecture and infrastructure were linked. I don't know if you've seen old images of London Bridge, or even now we have like the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. But, you know, we used to have dwelling on top of bridges, because I think to build a bridge was a huge investment, and so we made it into real estate. But somewhere along the lines, architecture and infrastructure got separated. I think what we're trying to say at this conference is that they need to come back together again if we're really trying to solve some of these world's grand challenges. Okay. Now, this design was actually taken quite seriously. We worked with Les Robertson as the structural engineer. We put it in the wind tunnel with RWDI. I think one of the features of the design are these wind slots that make the tower extremely aerodynamic, and that's what enables us to achieve the height of 1.6 kilometers. But then the wind slots and the way that this particular geometry kind of sort of alternates back and forth meant that there's no one single elevator which can go straight up through the building. And so we made certain assumptions about technologies, right, which would be required to support a building like this, but assumptions that were based on things that we knew were in the works, or things that are not too far away. And sure enough, about the time that I was working on Next Tokyo, Carl Otto was working on the Multi, okay, which is the maglev elevator. So it's the ropeless elevator which can travel vertically and horizontally. And so suddenly we had a technology solution to the building that we wanted to create. So, fast forward a few months. It just got me thinking that surely there must be other technologies out there that will enable us not just to build higher, but to just really understand the changes that are happening around us. Like I mentioned, technology and the way that it's, shaping the world in profound ways. I think it's not just about the height anymore. So technology is not just to build taller, it's about to build a different experience, right? CTBUH received the Henry C. Turner Prize from Turner Construction, and we applied that money towards this research project called Vertical Futures. Right? Now, so the idea of this research project is to identify the technologies and classify, audit them, but focusing on the ones specifically that enable sustainable vertical urbanism. And it was a lot of legwork, so it's sort of culling through publications, websites, talking to a lot of people, industry leaders, but also very importantly, talking to startups, right? See what's happening in the tech world, what are they doing? And the interesting thing is that a lot of them, a hell of a lot of them, from IBM all the way down to smart city startups, they're innovating in our space. And when I mean our space, I mean the traditional developer, architect, engineer. And it's my firm belief that the next great innovation in tall buildings will not come from us. Okay? It's going to come from a technologist. So we compiled a list, and it's a relatively small group of us. We actually have a research department in Venice, of all places. So our CTBUH research department is in Venice, along with others from Turner, CBRE. Okay, to compile a list of these technologies. And these will be presented to you here at the conference. I'll go through some of them, but also encourage you because now we're launching the survey. And the survey is a very important component of this research project because we're going to get from you additional information, but also ask you to evaluate these technologies that we've put forward. You are the professionals, and so some of these technologies might be pie in the sky and they may never materialize. Some might take some time to mature, but could have a profound impact on our industry. It's not up to a small handful of people to judge which is which or to really predict which is which. So that's why we want to put the question forward to the members of our council. So please, you can either go to ctbh.org vertical futures, and we have a dedicated workstation kind of in the middle of the exhibition space, which you can log in and respond to the survey. Okay, from your survey responses, we'll glean some useful criteria which we can use to evaluate each of the technologies that we're putting forward. Pervasiveness, like how widespread can this be? Scalability, like do we have a potential to be adopted at substantial scale? How different is the technology from what we currently have today? Is it incremental change or is it truly disruptive, right? And so forth. And the idea with that is by going through these metrics, understanding what's happening out there is to kind of understand what is the next big thing that's going to truly transform our industry. And these are some preliminary ideas of what those big things might be, and sort of broken up into discipline. So architecture becomes form and space. A lot of the innovations in architecture we've found are closely correlated with computing. So there's this convergence between architecture, specifically interior space, and computing. So this is the world of connected things, the Internet of Things. That's really going to change our user experience of being in an interior environment. But there's also another aspect of computing and architecture I want to touch on, and that's the notion that architecture is an art, right? That it's an act of creativity. I went to a conference which CBRE hosted in Singapore a couple weeks ago, and a gentleman from McKinsey presented their report, and it was talking about professions which would be made obsolete by computer automation, right? And so it showed a decline in jobs, particularly in administrative tasks, legal tasks, even some financial tasks, right? Which made the people at CBRE nervous. But interestingly enough, they said that architecture would go up, right? Because somehow architecture is perceived as a creative industry, and that a computer can never be as creative as a human being. Now, what we're seeing is a Rembrandt, okay? But it's not really a Rembrandt. Okay? It's an original work of art drawn by a computer in the style of Rembrandt. And it was actually 3D printed. And what this computer did, and this was done by researchers from Delft and from Microsoft, they used machine learning to study every Rembrandt portrait, and then asked the computer to take what it learned and create an original work in the style of Rembrandt. Okay, so if you think if a computer can draw a Rembrandt, then I think certainly it can automate a lot of the process that we do. And I'd be the first to say, a lot of the work that I do, right, could easily be done by a computer who studied the work that I did before. So I think the lesson here is that we need to constantly innovate. If you're not doing something different from your last project, then your work will be replaced by the computer someday. Okay, materials, okay, on a different note. So when it came to materials, we saw like a heavy correlation with biology. Okay, so it's sort of like the reemergence of biotech or nanotechnology. Right? And it's kind of interesting. So here we're seeing bacteria, okay, of all things, being used in a variety of different ways. So here's a shape-shifting fabric. Right now it's only at the scale they're using it in clothing. So sports clothing, they use this, and the whole concept is these little flaps are coated with this biofilm, and as that biofilm is subjected to heat and moisture, it curls up and it opens, and then the clothing can breathe, right? Now imagine this technology scaled up to a building facade, and then think about the possibilities. Harvested materials. I think we've talked a lot about wood skyscrapers. So the idea again about growing the material that we use in our buildings. What you're actually seeing is a demonstration tower that was built from bricks made from mushrooms, okay? And specifically the bacteria at the root of the mushroom that you sort of chop up and you grind it, you mix it with some wood, and it actually grows and hardens into something which is completely fireproof, high insulation value, and it has the structural properties of a brick, okay? Interestingly, the thing that right now isn't making this too commercially viable is you have to heat the brick at the end to kill off the mushroom because it's alive, it's still growing. So that's kind of an interesting twist when you think about using living materials in buildings. Self-healing concrete. So again, the idea of using bacteria, in this case it's a bacteria that when it's exposed to water, so when a crack opens up in concrete, it's exposed to water, it basically secretes, I think, calcium carbonate, which seals the crack in the concrete. So the idea that our buildings become more alive, okay? They actually become biological and they have the capacity to heal themselves. Flow. I gave a nod to ThyssenKrupp. I have to give a nod to Kohn now, right? So, elevating and vertical transportation in buildings is really, it's the first entry point of technology into a building, but it's also, I think, the first sort of departure point from the building out into the urban habitat. So it's that link, I think, between the building and its sort of environment. How do we get around? Now, the elevator companies have made great technological progress. The one thing, though, that I do see happening, which will fundamentally change our cities and the way that we get to our buildings and possibly in the future get up our buildings, is not just the driverless car, which you heard about, but an entire autonomous fleet. And it's already being done. So this is Uber in Pittsburgh, okay? And the whole idea with the autonomous fleet is that you don't own your car anymore, right? And because you don't own a car, we have much fewer cars on the road. We have like about 10% as many cars on the road because you're subscribing to a car service that shows up on demand. Now, the reason that autonomy is important is because that drops the price of the Uber to the point that it's equivalent to you owning and driving your own car. Drone delivery. Okay, so when it comes to construction, we've renamed it assembly because it has a high degree now of overlap with sort of automated processes. I like this video a lot, so I'm going to show it to you. So it's the idea now that we can collaborate together with robots, and we're seeing it on construction sites now, not necessarily the drones, but the idea that humans can work hand in hand with robots to produce things. If you've ever gone to a car factory, that's exactly how things are done. So certain things are done better by a machine, and certain things are done better by human hands. But nonetheless, here you see the capacity of a fleet of drones to construct a rather complex structure by moving around blocks. And it was all programmed from sort of three-dimensional model. So now you see an instance where we can take a building information model, embed it with extra intelligence that we can now begin to automate assembly processes. Okay, but I want to get to digitization because I think this is really a lot of what the discussion's about. Virtual reality, augmented reality, Internet of Things. Right? This year, I think we finally saw that one big, massive convergence of the physical and digital worlds. And unfortunately, it wasn't what I expected, but it was Pokemon Go, right? And if you think about it, I think within 15 days, it reached an adoption of 50 million users, and I think the television required 15 years, right, to reach that same effect. So massive capacity for technologies now to disseminate. So augmented reality. But it's also finding its way into buildings. Now, this is dubbed the world's smartest building, the Edge in Amsterdam. It's actually done by PLP, which is, if you're from KPF, you're not supposed to show their work, but I am, because it's really brilliant. But what they did here is they actually embedded sensors into just about everything, linked it together with data visualization, so you can see exactly what's going on in your building. You can control your environment. You can understand which desk you want to go to. This is 100% sort of hot desk work environment. And it also uses this really cool technology. It's called visible light communication. So in this case, I don't know if you remember, like ships, when they used to communicate, they would take the light and they would flick it on and off to do Morse code, and then two ships could communicate at distance. Now with LEDs, LEDs are able to blink on and off so rapidly that they also can communicate data, but it's so fast that our eyes cannot detect. So once we have this capacity to transmit data over light, then the light becomes your sensor network. Right? And then you connect the lights using what's called power over Ethernet, which is essentially data running over electricity. So now we can combine electricity with data, and we can combine light with data. So there's more ways now to move data throughout the building. And this is what's going to enable the connected experience in the Internet of Things. But at the same time, the work environment itself, in the space I just showed you, looks like a conventional work environment. But I think if we saw anything from the presentations today by Munsum, I think there's this real desire on the part now of humanity, I think, to really reconnect with nature. And this is a building I find particularly innovative in Japan. And what they do is they grow their own food inside their office space. So this idea of vertical agriculture, and it's not just to feed us, but I think to be able to reconnect us to nature. And I think that's really a byproduct of this sort of rapid technology and urbanization. And we see it happening everywhere. And Munsum showed you his projects, but CTBUH has also been advocating this for a number of years. One Central Park in Sydney, the Interlace in Singapore. And last year's best tall building was Bosco Verticale, the vertical forest. So in this case, it is a kind of technology because we weren't able to do this before, because now we have the technology to be able to grow agriculture cleanly within an urban space. So we can return agriculture into the city. And to just practice what I preach, this is my office in New York. So this is my little urban farm. We probably only generated, 5, 6 tomatoes, but I think the thing that people liked is that it actually uplifted the spirit of the whole studio, because suddenly you would come in every day and you would notice a change in your daily routine, because you would suddenly see that tomato that was green yesterday was suddenly red. And we actually planted these touch me nots, and the whole idea now is, you can get the sense of the environment being responsive to you. And so while we're using all this technology and the Internet of Things to create this responsiveness, I think we kind of underestimate the capacity of nature to be able to do the same. And then we can even think about flowers, like a moonflower which opens at night, or the morning glory which opens in the morning, as a kind of a form of data visualization, right? So the answer is not always in technology, okay, in spite of everything that I just said. Because ultimately, and where I think we're heading and what I think would be a wonderful future is something like Avatar. So it is this world of connectivity, but done in a very kind of biological way, with this sort of human spirit at its center. So I've presented many possible vertical futures to you. So it's really up to each of you and to us, I think, as a collective group, to not only choose which future we think is the best, but to set out and to make it happen. Thank you.